Hi everyone. The world was stunned. A nation once known as the most isolated and strictly communist on earth had suddenly become home to millions of Muslims. North Korea, the land of iron discipline and secrecy, was now 78% Muslim. It began quietly, almost like a whisper in the dark. Amid years of hunger, silence, and propaganda, people started searching for meaning. Some North Korean soldiers, who had once trained in the Middle East, returned home not just with military skills, but with something far more powerful: the Quran. At first, only a few dared to read it at night, by candlelight, in secret. They whispered verses they didn't yet understand, but somehow those words brought peace, a kind of peace their world had never offered. One by one, families began to follow, then whole villages, then cities, and finally, the whispers reached Kim Jong-un himself. What shocked the world wasn't the spread of Islam, it was Kim's reaction. Instead of suppressing it, he chose to protect it. If this faith brings peace to my people, then let Islam flourish in this land. I am not afraid of prayer. The broadcast echoed across the nation. People wept openly in the streets. For the first time in history, small mosques appeared in Pyongyang. The Adhan, the Muslim call to prayer, rose over a city once known only for silence and fear. It was the sound of rebirth. A new dawn had come, not through war or revolution, but through faith. When dawn prayers echoed over Pyongyang for the first time, it wasn't just the sound. It was a signal. Something deep within North Korean society had begun to shift. The government, once obsessed with control, found itself witnessing a revolution of the spirit, one that required no weapons, no protests, no propaganda. Schools that once taught loyalty to the party began introducing moral lessons inspired by the Quran. Teachers quietly replaced old slogans with verses about compassion, justice, and unity. At first, the generals were uneasy. Islam, to them, was foreign, a faith of deserts and distant lands. But when Kim Jong-un personally visited a newly built mosque in central Pyongyang, everything changed. He stood there silently, watching rows of men and women bow in prayer. No speeches, no cameras, only stillness. Later, in a private meeting with his council, Kim said, "For years we have ruled through fear, but these people, they obey out of love. Maybe that is true strength." From that moment, Islam was no longer seen as a threat. It became part of the national identity. Mosques were built in every province, designed with elegant Korean-inspired domes and traditional Hanok-style rooftops. The call to prayer blended with the sound of temple bells and wind through pine forests, a harmony no one could have imagined a decade earlier. Foreign journalists, once banned from entering, were invited to witness the new Korea. Videos of massive Friday prayers in Pyongyang's main square went viral across the world. Tens of thousands of people, men, women, and children, standing shoulder to shoulder, whispering Allahu Akbar as snow gently fell around them. And yet it wasn't just religion that changed. It was the soul of the nation. Crime rates fell. Families reunited. Even the military, once the symbol of fear, adopted a new motto: strength with faith. The impossible had happened. The world's most closed nation had opened its heart, not to capitalism or democracy, but to God. The world could hardly believe what it was seeing. For decades, North Korea had stood alone, isolated by sanctions, feared by neighbors, mistrusted by allies. But now, a strange new reality was unfolding. Muslim nations were extending their hands to Pyongyang. It began with whispers of cooperation from Indonesia, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. Then came official visits, planes landing in Pyongyang carrying scholars, imams, and diplomats instead of weapons or trade negotiators. For the first time in living memory, the capital's frozen air carried not the sound of marching boots, but the murmur of Arabic greetings. Assalamu alaikum. Kim Jong-un himself appeared changed. Gone was the stern, distant figure known to the world. In public meetings, he smiled more, spoke softly, and often quoted verses about mercy and justice. Rumors spread that he had begun studying the Quran personally, guided by scholars from Mecca and Jakarta. International media scrambled to interpret the shift. BBC called it the spiritual revolution of the century. Al Jazeera simply titled its headline, "Pyongyang Prays." With the rise of Islam came unexpected transformation in foreign policy. North Korea opened its first halal trade zone near the Chinese border, exporting organic food and textiles to Muslim countries. Pilgrims were granted special permission to travel to Mecca, a journey once thought impossible for any North Korean. Even more astonishing, a massive Grand Mosque began construction in the heart of Pyongyang, built in collaboration with architects from Malaysia and Egypt. Its design blended modern minimalism with Korean tradition, curved roofs meeting marble domes, Arabic calligraphy flowing beside Hangul script. During its groundbreaking ceremony, Kim addressed the crowd. "The world divided us with politics, but faith unites us beyond borders. Today, North Korea stands not alone, but as part of one ummah." That night, the city glowed. Lanterns and crescent moons lined the streets. Children sang Islamic hymns in Korean, while old men wept openly, unable to believe they were witnessing such a transformation. The once feared hermit kingdom had become something else entirely, a beacon of faith and unity in the modern world. By the spring of 2030, news agencies could no longer ignore it. North Korea was no longer the same nation. What had once been synonymous with secrecy and suppression had transformed into a society centered on prayer, community, and compassion. But not everyone welcomed this awakening. In Washington and Brussels, political analysts were in disbelief. Intelligence reports described something unthinkable: the Islamic Republic of Korea. Behind closed doors, world leaders debated whether the change was genuine or a new kind of strategy, a geopolitical mirage. But no one could deny what satellites and journalists saw. Millions praying in Pyongyang squares, Qurans being printed openly, and schools replacing portraits of past leaders with verses about patience and forgiveness. CNN ran the headline, "From Dictatorship to Devotion, What's Happening in North Korea?" Meanwhile, Muslim-majority countries rejoiced. In Jakarta, massive crowds celebrated the miracle of Pyongyang, while in Istanbul, the call to prayer was followed by special supplications for their new brothers and sisters in faith. Even Mecca saw an unprecedented sight of thousands of North Korean pilgrims arriving together for the first time, dressed in white, weeping as they circled the Kaaba. But admiration came with fear. Western commenters called it the biggest ideological shift since the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Military strategists worried about the formation of a new bloc, a coalition of Muslim-majority nations stretching from the Middle East to East Asia. At the same time, global corporations found themselves facing a moral and economic dilemma. Would they continue sanctioning a nation that now preached peace and charity? Or would they risk being left behind as North Korea entered a new era of trade, one driven not by greed, but by ethics? Through it all, Kim Jong-un remained calm, rarely appearing in public. When he finally spoke again, it was not through the usual channels of propaganda, but through a worldwide broadcast of the Friday sermon from the Grand Mosque of Pyongyang. "Once our nation lived in darkness," he said, his voice steady. "Now the light of faith has reached even us. We do not seek power, only peace, but we will protect that peace with everything we have." The world watched, divided between awe and suspicion. Some saw hope, others saw a new threat. But one truth had become undeniable. North Korea had redefined the meaning of revolution. By the mid-2030s, the world map had changed. not by conquest, but by conviction. What began as whispers of faith inside North Korea had rippled across continents, rewriting alliances and identities. The newly renamed Islamic Republic of Korea, IRK, stood as a symbol of impossible transformation. Once the most secretive nation on earth, it now led one of the most transparent humanitarian networks in Asia. Aid missions bearing the crescent flag of the IRK arrived in Yemen, Sudan, and even Gaza, carrying food, medicine, and volunteers, not soldiers. The West didn't know how to respond. Their sanctions, once used to isolate, now looked like acts of cruelty against a nation preaching peace. Their media, once mocking, now struggled to explain how a former dictatorship had become a model of spiritual government, disciplined, moral, and deeply united. Kim Jong-un's image, too, had transformed. He no longer wore the military uniform that defined his rule. Instead, he appeared in modest attire, greeting guests with calm humility. In interviews, he quoted both the Quran and Korean proverbs, speaking of balance, mercy, and responsibility. Power without compassion is like fire without warmth. It burns, but never comforts, he said once to an Al Jazeera journalist. Under his leadership, the IRK launched the Moonlight Initiative, a coalition of Asian and Middle Eastern nations aimed at eradicating poverty and promoting education rooted in moral values. In Seoul, once the rival capital, South Koreans began to look north with unexpected admiration. Student movements advocating for unification under shared faith and peace gained massive traction. For the first time in 70 years, the Korean peninsula no longer dreamed of war, but of oneness. The transformation went beyond politics. Technologists in Pyongyang developed sustainable energy systems inspired by the Quranic principle of mizan, balance with nature. Farmers replaced state propaganda banners with Arabic calligraphy praising gratitude. Even music changed. Traditional Korean instruments now blended with soft recitations and Middle Eastern melodies, echoing across radio waves that once carried only orders. The global balance of power was shifting. No longer divided by ideology, nations began aligning by spiritual values. And at the heart of it all stood a country that once symbolized fear, now radiating hope. As night fell over Pyongyang, the city lights formed crescents across the skyline. From every corner, voices rose together in harmony, the adhan carried by the cold northern wind. For the first time in human history, the most closed nation on earth had opened its soul, and in doing so, reminded the world that faith could achieve what politics never could.